Okay, welcome back everyone. We're continuing with chapter 13. So far in 13.1 and 13.2, we are exploring the antebellum era. And again, the word antebellum means before war. So we're looking at events that led us up to the Civil War. And I like to argue that in many ways, the Mexican-American War sort of renewed the debate on slavery that ultimately propels the United States into the Civil War. So before the Mexican-American War, the topic of slavery wasn't really discussed that much anymore in politics. We had the Missouri Compromise that sort of settles the differences between the North and the South. We had Martin Van Buren's gag rule. It doesn't seem as if slavery is going to be the topic that's going to divide the North and the South. Now, in fact, Northerners and Southerners disagreed more on topics like tariffs or internal improvements. But after the Mexican-American War, with the addition of new territory like California, New Mexico, and Utah, it seems as if slavery is a major topic again. Okay, so in 13.1 and 13.2, we keyed in on really big and important antebellum events, like the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, what happened to Anthony Burns, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, leading to Bleeding Kansas, and also the Dred Scott decision. Okay, so basically we see this debate between North and South continually begin to escalate, especially as more Northerners are becoming abolitionists. Okay, now today we're going to look at other ways in which the North and South continually disagreed, and were divided on a variety of antebellum topics. Okay, so we'll start with 13.3, the economy, the Panic of 1857, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So explain how the economic crisis of 1857 and the growing political crises of the decade impacted each other and led the nation to divide. Now, up until this point, we've kind of been discussing sectionalism as North versus South and East versus West. And historically, especially since the time of the yeoman farmers and Jeffersonian democracy, Western farmers and Southern farmers sort of felt this connection to each other, okay? So both Western farmers and Southerners sort of viewed the North as the enemy. And so traditionally, the North, it was those, New England and middle colony regions, right, where you had those major colonial cities. Now, things have changed since the Market Revolution. So during the Market Revolution, the Midwest, which is right here, becomes connected to the North. And that happens through the construction of transportation networks, right? Trading networks such as the Erie Canal, the National Road, the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, so because of these new trading networks and these new transportation systems, all of these farmers that are out west now actually feel really connected to everyone here in the North, okay? Because now there's faster, cheaper, more efficient ways to get Western goods out to those northern markets, okay? So the West kind of abandoned the South, right? And the Midwest feels this connection to the North. And because of that, this newly formed Republican Party, they're going to represent all of the interests of what the North now is, okay? And now the North has sort of expanded to be much, much bigger. Okay, and additionally, the economy is definitely forcing the Southerners to see the North as the enemy too. Because, the South does not want to support federal tariffs, right? They don't like the idea of the American system or taxes or banks. They definitely don't want to be taxed so that their money can pay for, the northern canals. So back in the day, the West wouldn't have liked these taxes either. But now the West knows that if they pay these taxes, they get all of these new trading networks that they might not have gotten before. Okay, so we're now seeing a bigger economic division between North and South than previously. Now, this division becomes more evident in the Panic of 1857. So the Panic of 1857 occurs with overproduction of northern wheat. Okay, so there's too much wheat that is being produced in the North, probably in those, breadbasket states. And when you overproduce something, the prices go down and the economy goes down in turn, okay? But here's what's unique about the Panic of 1857. Even though the prices of crops in the North decreased, the prices of crops in the South were fine. cotton maintains its value. And so what the Panic of 1857 sort of demonstrates to us is that an economic panic in the North is no longer affecting the South. Now remember back in 1819 when the South overproduced cotton, it ruined the entire economy because the northern and southern economies were intertwined. But now that we're seeing in the Panic of 1857, maybe North and South aren't as interconnected as they were before. So this economic division is only further creating this divide between North and South that had already existed because we know North and South have different views of what the government should look like, right? They have different political views, social views, and now economically, they don't even really need each other anymore, okay? So we're definitely seeing major changes. Now, the other topic that is covered in 13.3 is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And this might kind of seem misplaced because the Lincoln-Douglas debates are a series of debates all, around the state of Illinois for a Senate seat in 1858, okay? So essentially, every few years, we have elections for senator. In the state of Illinois in 1858, the two candidates running against each other were Stephen Douglas as a Democrat and Abraham Lincoln as a Free Soil Republican. Okay, now we've already met Stephen Douglas before. Douglas is the same senator who introduced the idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he came up with this proposal of popular sovereignty to let Kansas and Nebraska vote on whether or not they wanted slavery, right? So he essentially caused Bleeding Kansas, okay? But Stephen Douglas is the incumbent. So this means that he's already holding the position of senator, okay? So he's running for re-election, and it's very likely he's probably going to win. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he's kind of a nobody. So no one really understood who he was, what he stood for. He was kind of obscure, and he enters into the Senate race as a Free Soil Republican. Now, keep in mind, the Republican Party is brand new, right? Not everybody knows what the Republican Party is all about. And here's something to note about Abraham Lincoln. He started off as a free soiler. So he's not really one of these staunch radical abolitionists. He's not trying to abolish slavery everywhere yet, okay? So at this time, he's a free soiler. So he just doesn't want to see slavery extend to new territories. So these two are running against each other for senator. And, I think this picture down here is kind of funny because, you can see that Abraham Lincoln is sort of towering over Stephen Douglas in comparison, okay? But here's the deal with Illinois. It's a free state. So ever since the Northwest Ordinance, which was passed, through the Articles of Confederation years and years and years before, Illinois has been a free territory and a free state. So it's pretty crazy that the series of debates between Lincoln and Douglas, slavery is actually the main topic, right? Even though slavery doesn't exist in the state that they're running for the Senate. Okay, so that just shows you how much slavery has become a national topic and why the Lincoln-Douglas debates were important. Now, ultimately, after the debates, Stephen Douglas won. Okay, so he wins re-election. And Abraham Lincoln can't even win a Senate seat in his own state, and yet he's still going to try to run for president in 2 years. Okay, so it's pretty crazy. It's sort of brave of him, very, a lot of confidence, right? But why is this so significant? Okay, so it shows us, number one, slavery is being discussed. So everywhere. It doesn't matter if the state has slavery or not, but also, Lincoln is able, through these debates, to share his Republican ideals with the public. So people are not, going to need to hear what he stands for, right? For the very first time with these debates, he gets to share that. Okay, and so when he runs for the presidency in 1860, people have sort of already heard his stance and his ideals before, 2 years before. Okay. Now, so that takes us to 13.4, from John Brown to secession of the South. So really, this learning objective kind of walks us through the 3 phases that we're going to go through in 13.4. So it says, analyze the political impact of John Brown's raid and why Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, and the southern states then voted to leave. Okay, so John Brown's raid, election of 1860, and then southern states leave. Okay, so those are the topics we're going to go through. Now, so far, we've talked about all of the differences between the North and the South, political, social, ideological, economic, okay? But, we even did political parties because now the North is entirely Republican and the South is entirely Democratic, okay? But what's even crazier is that there was actually a physical division between North and South. So the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland actually had a name, and that was referred to as the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, so it just so happens that the states north of the Mason-Dixon line, so Pennsylvania and above, right? So you can kind of see that on the map here, they were all free. And the states south of the Mason-Dixon line, from Maryland down, are going to be all slave. Okay, so again, this division is not just something people talk about or something they, kind of feel or have ideas about. They can actually see it too, right? So there's this obvious line dividing the North and South. Okay, now, this section is really supposed to start with John Brown's raid. So let me give you guys a little bit of background about who John Brown is. John Brown is a northern white abolitionist, and he even participated in bleeding Kansas after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. Okay, so John Brown went to Kansas to help fight with the abolitionists to make Kansas a free state. Now he fails there because remember, Kansas doesn't really resolve any issues. There was just a lot of fighting, and Kansas remains a territory. Okay, so he decides to step it up and take things almost to the next level. Okay, so what he does is very crazy, it's very bold and extremely radical. Okay, so John Brown wants to lead other abolitionists to raid Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Now, Harper's Ferry is a federal arsenal. Okay, so let me explain what this means. The word federal means that it is, owned or, organized by the federal government. And an arsenal is a really strongly fortified place that has weapons and, government equipment and stuff. Okay, so here's John Brown's plan. Lead a bunch of abolitionists to raid Harper's Ferry, steal the weapons from Harper's Ferry, distribute them, and rebel against the federal government in the name of abolitionism in those southern states. Okay, so he goes ahead and he launches John Brown's raid in 1859, and of course he stopped because when you go storm a federal arsenal, there's going to be federal troops there. Okay. He was arrested with other raiders and was ultimately sentenced to death as a result of his conviction of treason. Okay. Now, when he's sentenced to death, right, you can see what's going to happen, at least in this image, right? So he's sentenced to death. He's going to be executed, but Northerners start to view him as a martyr. Okay, so they view him as someone who is dying for a worthy cause. So if you look at this image, right, it shows John Brown sort of standing almost like reminiscent of like a Christ-like figure, right? And he's convincing Northerners that, maybe John Brown is onto something, because all the way up until 1859, most Northerners, even though they hated slavery and they thought slavery was morally wrong or believed in free labor, whatever, abolition for whatever reason, they thought that the problem with slavery could be, solved using compromise. We've seen this ever since the 3/5 Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, right? The Compromise of 1850. They've always tried to reason with the South in order to solve the issue of slavery. But now Northerners are starting to think, maybe this guy, John Brown, he's right. Maybe we do need to use violence to abolish slavery. So it's starting to kind of plant the seed of potentially going to war against the South in the name of abolitionism. Now, John Brown's raid was all the talk in 1859. Everyone heard about it. Okay, so let's see how different people's responses were to this particular event. Okay, so first you have Henry David Thoreau. Okay, and Thoreau was a transcendentalist, right? He was a believer of civil disobedience. If you don't think a law is just, then you just need to, don't follow that law. And that's exactly what Thoreau did during the Mexican-American War. And after John Brown's raid, Henry David Thoreau stated, yeah, the raid is bad and maybe, borderline extreme, because who raids a federal arsenal and tries to steal federal weapons? However, he states that slavery is worse than that. It's worse than the raid. You can't even compare the two because slavery is so much worse, right? Then you have William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, so William Lloyd Garrison is that white abolitionist who wrote The Liberator and created the American Anti-Slavery Society. And we know that Garrison is also a pacifist, which means that he does not believe in violence. However, despite the fact that he never thought violence was a good idea, he argued that John Brown's raid showed how desperate the North was to get rid of slavery, that they had to try everything, right? They tried everything else as far as compromise, but they had to resort to this. They had no other choice but to use violence. Okay, so here's a man who never condoned violence, but now is saying, okay, maybe this is now our only option that we have left. Okay, now Northerners in general are going to view John Brown as a martyr, and Southerners start to feel offended by that and very threatened, right? That Northerners are even seeing John Brown as a hero. Because if Northerners view John Brown as a hero and condone what he did, maybe there is a potential for this to happen again, right? Someone else is going to want to mimic him. And the South does not have any tolerance for that, okay? They don't want to worry about a potential civil war, okay? Now, how does this happen, right? So it's because it seems as if within this decade, throughout 1850, all we're trying to do is compromise and sort of make everyone happy, okay? Now, so much has happened in such a short period of time, and I wanted to put sort of two presidential elections back to back to show you that, we're traveling back in time just a little bit. So let's go to the 1856 election. Okay, so in 1856 election, no one was yet ready to divide over the issue of slavery. Okay, so this is shortly after the Republican Party is created. We still don't really know what the Republicans are all about, and so in the 1856 election, you have Republicans versus know-nothings versus Democrats. And James Buchanan wins because when he ran for president, he purposely didn't bring up the topic of slavery because he knew it's going to divide votes. So if you look at the map here, right, we have sectionalized results here. Right? You can see that there is division. Most of the Republican votes are going to come from the North, and then you have most of the South, right, are going to go for Buchanan. And that's going to be, this issue of slavery, right? It still doesn't come up, but there still is enough division that we can see, but, not enough to justify going to war. Okay, now that's Now that was 1856, but now by 1860, things are very different. Okay, so the division is much clearer. So how does this happen? Well, maybe it's because between 1856 and 1860, so many major antebellum events are going to change the mind of Northerners. We had Bleeding Kansas. We had the Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We have the Panic of 1857. We have John Brown's raid. All of these events made Northerners angry, and they were more and more likely to support abolitionism and the Republican cause. So in 1860, we have a very different outlook in this electoral map. Okay, 1860 is very, very unique because there were 4 candidates running for president. And whenever you have 4 candidates running for president, it's very difficult for one single candidate to win the majority of electoral votes, because how is one person, out of 4 actually going to get over 50%, right? So here are the four candidates. Okay, so you have Abraham Lincoln representing the Republican Party. You have Stephen Douglas with the Democratic Party. Okay, and this is crazy because remember they ran against each other 2 years before, right? Douglas is the one who defeats Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so you also have John Bell running for the Constitutional Union Party and John Breckinridge for the Southern Democratic Party. Okay, so four candidates running for president. It seems very likely that the House of Representatives is going to have to decide the winner. However, it's crazy. After the votes are tallied in 1860, there is a winner. We don't have to go to the House of Representatives. The winner is, in 1860, is Abraham Lincoln. Okay? Now, Abraham Lincoln won with only northern votes. Not a single southern state even casted one electoral vote for him. Many states didn't even have Abraham Lincoln on their ballot. He had the support of free soilers and all those Republicans, people who supported, John Brown's raid. Okay, now the question is how? Right? So let's go back to this map really quick. So we discussed all the way up until now, the South had held all of the political power. Okay, they had all of the electoral votes. They had votes in Congress because of the 3/5 compromise. But slowly and gradually, what the Northerners have been doing is they've been amassing more and more political power without the Southerners sort of even noticing. So they've acquired additional free states. Okay, so if you look at how high the electoral count is for some of these states, right? Essentially, what's been happening in the past few decades is exactly what we went over in chapter 12, right? Immigration. Okay, so we've had immigrants come from China and move to California. We've had immigrants from Ireland, for example, right, move to a lot of these northern cities. Okay, and immigrants from Germany moving to the Midwest. So millions and millions of people are now populating the North. And those numbers are going to be something the South doesn't even expect, right? So the North is gradually gaining more of this extra power, and the South doesn't even, expect it or prepare for it. Now, the South is getting worried. If Lincoln can win with only northern votes, what else can Lincoln do with only northern votes? So can Lincoln propose to abolish slavery? Will he get enough votes in Congress now to make that happen, even if southern states don't vote for that, if they vote against it? So the South gets really worried. And there's one southern state that says, we're not going to stick around and find out. Right? So South Carolina decides that Lincoln's election, that means they're out. They're going to secede from the Union. Okay? And so you could see here on this picture, independence declared, South Carolina, December 20th, 1860, they are done. Okay, now this is not the first time South Carolina wanted to secede from the Union, right? They threatened to do this even with the nullification crisis of 1832. South Carolina says they are no longer part of the United States. They are now part of the Confederate States of America under the leadership of Jefferson Davis. Okay, now Congress is worried. Okay, so South Carolina just left. What if all of these other states want to leave too? Remember, Abraham Lincoln is elected in November. Okay, so he's not inaugurated. He's not in the president's, office of the presidency until March. So Congress is kind of hoping that maybe there's something that can be done and figured out before March that could stop other southern states from seceding. So in Congress, there was a proposal called the Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Compromise was this idea to actually extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way from East Coast to West Coast. So let's just draw this big old line and cut the United States in half. North will forever be free, South will forever be slave. Okay, we could even make it a constitutional amendment, so it'll never be an issue in the future. However, it doesn't seem like that's a smart idea to divide the country in order, to make efforts to prevent a division, right, or a civil war. So Abraham Lincoln rejects it. He also is concerned about, states up here, near Missouri, okay, because we have to understand that, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, they're north of this line, right? So they're north of the 3630 line. They would have to give up their slaves too if the Crittenden Compromise goes into effect. Okay, so those states are going to be mad. And, if they try to secede, ultimately, Abraham Lincoln doesn't want to appease the South, but nevertheless, you still have this idea that these are sort of above that Missouri Compromise line. Where are they going to fit in? Okay, so the Crittenden Compromise never gets ratified. It never passes. It seems as if, the months are going by. Congress, is kind of at a loss. They don't know what to do to keep the southern states from seceding. And so March rolls around, and it's time for Abraham Lincoln to become president of the United States. When he's inaugurated as president, he gave an inaugural address, and essentially in that, the inaugural address is the president's plan, right? Their map for the next 4 years. So sort of let me tell you, to the country what I have intended for the United States. Now, in his inaugural address, he states that secession is illegal. Okay, you can't just walk away from the United States. He promises that he would leave slavery alone. He's going to leave it where it is. Abraham Lincoln sort of doesn't believe that he's even capable of ending slavery. Okay, so he's not going to try to get rid of it where it already legally exists, and he would enforce the Fugitive Slave Act as long as free blacks, however, are protected. Okay, so he was worried that free blacks in the North would be unjustly sent to slavery in the South, even though they were free. Now, even though it seems as if Lincoln is sort of being fairly generous to the South, most of the Southerners view this, though, as a threat, especially the fact that he declares secession illegal, when we know the ideas of nullification and secession are so important to the Southern states, right? Ever since the Jeffersonian era, the South, right, sort of began to raise troops now, okay? So war is going to begin, and it's going to begin in 1861 at Fort Sumter. And of course, all states, South Carolina, and the reason why it happens at Fort Sumter is just because it's very unique conditions and circumstances. Fort Sumter is an American federal fort, and it's owned by the United States, but geographically it's in the South, right? It's in South Carolina. Now, obviously, this is going to cause some problems. Fort Sumter, and all of the people inside who are guarding Fort Sumter are working for the U.S. government, right? But they begin to run out of supplies. And so the United States tries to send supplies or in supply ships with extra food and medicine to these people at Fort Sumter, but South Carolina is not going to allow those ships to come to shore to deliver those supplies. Okay, so Jefferson Davis and the Confederate States of America, they demand that the U.S. troops inside of the fort, they abandon the fort because it's sitting in South Carolina. Now, they refuse to do so. So Jefferson Davis ordered an attack on the fort on April 12th of 1861. And so technically speaking, the Confederate States of America attacked the United States fort at Fort Sumter. This is when the war begins. Okay, so Fort Sumter surrenders and the Civil War commences in 1861, and it will continue until 1865. Okay, now here's the deal. When the war first started, Lincoln's main objective was actually not to abolish slavery. Okay, so his objective was to save the Union. He wanted to bring the country back together. And keep in mind, I feel like I'm just breaking every image you might have of Abraham Lincoln. But first, I introduce him as the sort of loser who doesn't win the election in his Senate race, and now he's almost like a fraud, right? So Abraham Lincoln starts his presidency. He doesn't want to abolish slavery, right? And he's okay with keeping slavery where it was. He was a free soiler. And when the Civil War began, his only goal was to save the Union. And many abolitionists are upset with him that he wasn't, going to go to war. He wouldn't make war about slavery. Well, at least not quite yet. Okay, so he just wants to bring the Southern states back. Now, he also believes that he did not have the constitutional power or authority to end slavery, right? So there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the office of the president the power of the executive branch to just sort of order that slavery is abolished. Okay. Now, in addition to South Carolina, most of the southern states joined the Confederacy. So you could see here that they're, physically they're states that are leaving the Union. They declare that they are no longer a part of the United States. They are the Confederate States of America. And then all of those states, they left, but there's, all of those states that left, the one state that's really going to hurt America is going to be the state of Virginia. Okay, so here's the deal with Virginia. America has a lot of roots there, right? So a lot of our founding fathers come from Virginia. We also have Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which has a bunch of our, military stuff. And Virginia also has this rich military history, very good generals. Okay, so you have, George Washington. And in fact, the U.S. Army's favorite general, Robert E. Lee, is from Virginia. Now, when Virginia secedes from the Union, Lee kind of says that he has to represent his home state. Okay, so the Confederate States of America just got one of the United States military's best generals. Okay, so now it looks as if, I know it's sort of confusing. We see these sort of red states down here that did secede. And then we see some of these states in the middle, right, that are sort of striped. They're red and blue. Okay, so what's the deal with those? We call these border states. So essentially, these border states are going to be really important to Abraham Lincoln. He does not want the border states to go to the Confederacy. Okay, and here's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, one border state he absolutely wants to keep is Kentucky. Okay, so Kentucky is actually a state that has the Ohio River as its northern border. And so essentially if Kentucky joins the North, or it stays in the North, that means that the Ohio River, which is in the northern border of Kentucky, would also stay in the Union. So it would belong to the United States, which gives Abraham Lincoln a tactical advantage because, of course, you want to have a lot of waterways and as many rivers as possible when you're fighting a war. So again, Kentucky has a river as its northern border, and that's why it's important for us to try and keep Kentucky. Okay, now also Abraham Lincoln, he really wants to keep Maryland too. Just so it happens, Maryland gets sent to the Confederacy, or, Maryland secedes from the Union, the United States, what are they going to do with Washington, D.C., right? So they'd have no way of getting to Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is, nestled right in between Maryland, right? So if Maryland leaves, then how are we going to access the White House or the Capitol or any of that, okay? So Abraham Lincoln does everything he could to sort of keep these border states happy and stay in the Union. So Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and West Virginia, they end up staying in the North. Now, this is why Abraham Lincoln couldn't make the Civil War a war about slavery. These border states are striped red and blue because technically they are slave states that actually stayed in the North. Okay, so they have slavery, but they're going to stay part of the Union. If Abraham Lincoln makes this war about slavery, and he's going to abolish slavery, the border states, they're going to leave. And it would have put the United States at a huge disadvantage in the American Civil War. Okay, so that's why at this point, the Civil War is not yet a war about slavery. We're going to learn when that changes in chapter 14. Okay, so thank you for joining me for this one. I hope you guys have a good understanding of the antebellum era now.